So this is the third part of embedding gender identity ideology into culture, and I want to focus on two of the core skills. They're almost like the reins in one hand, or they go hand in hand. And that one, so one of the tools is the conversion therapy bands, and the second one is the diversity and inclusion audits. Over in UK, that's Stonewall's diversity champions. In ACON, in Australia, it's ACON's diversity inclusion audits, particularly the Australian Workplace Equality Index. And I think in New Zealand, that's probably the rainbow tick. I'm not sure about New Zealand. So that's what we're covering at this time. Before we do, though, I do want to talk about something that was quite significant that happened in Australia. It was something that a lawyer friend of mine pointed out. She'd noticed that she was going through all the legislation in Australia, going back to, I think, about 2008 or something. And what she noticed that where the word sex was in a legislation, it was being changed to the word gender. So it begs the question, why would that be? You know, on one part, you know that gender is a word, sometimes it's used as a polite word for sex, because people tend to think someone's having sex rather than someone's sex. So that might be it, and that might be why it passed through. But the question has to be asked, if you change the word sex to gender in legislation, and then you change the definition of gender, can you actually eradicate sex-based rights by that simple change? That's a question I'm asking. So what she did, I'll just bypass this, there's the major players I mentioned before. She had a look at all the legislations, and you can have a look for yourself and go through them. I've highlighted the yellow ones, yellow lines that significant things have occurred, but I'm not going to spell it out. Just at your own pace, you can pause and read the legislation where these things have happened and events that are important. And I'm just going to click through them like so. So, change the word sex to gender, and with one redefinition of the word gender, yes, actually, if you really look into it, and this might be a topic of another time, you can remove sex-based rights in Australia. So how sneaky is that? And that is one of the strategies in the Denton's handbooks, which is do things underneath the radar. Bring in laws, piggybacking things, but also do things by stealth. So I wanted to mention that prior to talking about the Victorian conversion therapy ban, which is the gold standard to follow according to Stonewall for the rest of the world. So I was really curious as to why there was a Victorian conversion therapy ban. There's nothing in the news, there's nothing anywhere about there being any of the practices around aversion therapy, electrocution, ice baths, etc. these days. In fact, you know, if you have a look at the LGBTQI rights websites, they'll tell you, even they'll say that that ended around the 1950s. So what are they going on about? So I was curious about that, and I decided to look into it. I'm jumping ahead of myself. One of the things I've noticed with looking at the IlGA World's training materials it gave to the youth activists, so IlGA's role in the whole change management process is that of trainers of change management, trainers of the youth, and they gave them change management models and the change management process and the techniques to bring in change management and how to frame your words and how to frame the conversations, etc. And when I looked into the change management, the playbook that's happening in Australia and the rest of the world, what I noticed is that out of the 12 or so change management models there are, that the one that was closest to what they were following, pretty close, was Cotter's 8-step change management process. It's a very simple model. It's easy to set up in any organisation. And if you think back to the last video I did on part 2, when you bring in a major change, like for example the change from analog to digital that happened in the 80s, from doing things manually to doing things on the computer, then you need a change management model, and this one really seemed to fit the bill perfectly. So I'm going to use that to demonstrate how you bring in a cultural change process, because that's how we do it. So the first step you'll notice is create urgency. All right, get to what I want to talk about. So, as I said, I was really curious, how come we're talking about this conversion therapy? The initial inquiry for the bill was created by Victoria's Minister of Health. Her name is Jill Hennessy, and it wasn't driven by any kind of complaints at all, as was suggested in the bill's readings in Parliament. But in 2018, Jill Hennessy formally instructed the Health Complaints Commission to inquire into conversion therapy. And despite the fact that since the HCC, Health Complaints Commission, was set up in February 2017, no one came forward with any formal complaint that any incidents of harm from counselling out of same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria, or that there was any aversion therapy, was actually happening in Australia. Okay. So the HCC didn't produce a public report. It only came up with a 2-page executive summary in October 2018. I read it. It was critical of conversion therapy that happened in the past, and it was critical of conversion therapy like in Iran overseas, but there was nothing about conversion therapy happening here in Australia. And I'll put links down so you can read it for yourself. Okay. We were told that Jill Hennessy formed the view from that urgent legislative change was required based on that executive summary. And then she put together a second independent report, as was said, which she received in November 2018, and that was produced by the La Trobe Gay and Lesbian Health, GLHGV, a unit that was underneath that acronym at La Trobe University, and it was actually funded by Victoria government. So nothing independent about it at all. How did I find that out? Because if you go and look at you just look at the annual report, it's easy. So you just find it there. It was totally funded by Victoria government, So that was... So, it was a lie. It was disingenuous. It was a report funded by the Victorian government itself that became the key reason and the key research for the government to act, and to act urgently. Note, all interested stakeholders that you would expect to be consulted around this topic, like homosexuals and bisexual people who reject gender identity ideologies, women's groups, parent groups, etc. None of those people were consulted. Okay, and I'll put some links down on this as well. So the next step in this change management model is look at forming a powerful coalition, which they did. They formed a powerful coalition between the government and the LGBTQIA, who are the people who basically wrote this bill. And they excluded all other parties that will have an interest or will be impacted by this bill and the act it would become. But so I noticed that it actually took words from the 2-page Health Complaints Commission report to create and communicate its vision. So that's the next step: create a vision for change and then communicate that vision. So these are the words that I heard from Andrew Dan, the Premier, in selling this. He said it wants to denounce the harm that's caused in the past and it being caused for any practice that remain ongoing. It wants to affirm no sexual orientation or gender identity and need a broken and need of fixing. Even heard that phrase repeated in New Zealand recently, the same, like exact same word. So everybody copycats off each other and sets up a template that everybody follows, a playbook that people follow. No sexual orientation or gender identity continues, blah, 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 blah. You can read that for yourself and pause. So done. Got a vision, communicate the vision. So the next one, empower the action. So this act sets up a civil response scheme It involves empowering the existing Victoria Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission to create the Commission. This is what it's called, the Commission over here. And the Commission's goal is to investigate any reports of people attempting to change or suppress sexual orientation or gender identity, and has the power to execute severe sanctions, i.e. up to $1 million to an organisation, and up to $250,000 to an individual in 10 years in jail. So Catherine Deves, who's now a practicing lawyer, wrote up an excellent piece. I've got it on Fraying the Net. Actually, I'll get her to put it on her own website. It's really good. That goes through exactly what the Commission is. And it's one of the most chilling parts of the Act, that it is now an Act, it became an Act in January, that it gives itself powers that the Commonwealth doesn't even have over people. I don't want to actually go much into it, but to say it places itself as judge, jury and executioner. It's like a big brother. It oversees that gender affirmation culture, that a gender identity ideology is going to happen, and there will be punishment for people and organisations if it does not. And you can read up about that there. Okay. And the conversion also it created quick wins. That's the next step. So lesbian, gay is not a word in the Discrimination Act anymore over there. I'll double check that, by the way, but I think it's now gender rather than sex. It further cements the position of gender identity as a protected attribute under the law, which has heaps of impacts on women and children. It gives rights for men into single-sex spaces and to shortlists, essentially one of the key things I notice about all these acts is it removes the ontological class of women, it removes our political power, it removes our sovereignty to make decisions on our behalf, it puts everything back into the hands of men. Anyway, so you might want to pause and read some of the quick wins. Holly Lawford-Smith, an associate professor over at Uni Melbourne. Okay, so let's tick off that steps. It created a commission, it powered the action, and it created a whole bunch of quick wins. Alright, so here's something that I listened to everybody that were kind of laughing, saying how stupid they've made this gender identity to be so circular and to have so vague that it could mean anything and everything. And to me, that was obvious. Well, of course it is. Because you've made a definition that's left to the Commission to determine what is or what is not an offence. It's so vague, it's so nebulous, but they get to define it. So if they're after an organisation that's not compliant, or a person they want to set up, we have a word in training called putting a head on a stick, which is you make an example of someone. You put a head on the stick. If they wanted to target someone who was had their head over the parapet and was actually being listened to, they could target that person, and they get to define what the offence is, and they get to define the criminal penalty at that person. So now, what's interesting is that that's where ACON's pride and diversity audits come in, specifically with the diversity audit, Australian Workplace Equality Index. Remember, this comes out of ACON, it's a trans hub, it's one who produced it, the Australian Workplace Equality Index. It used to be a good charity doing HIV stuff, and now it's gone, it's rebranded itself as a pride and diversity champion. It's basically a trans lobby that is a marketing arm of the pharmaceutical industry. A part of IlGA World, which is associated with pedophile groups, NAMBLA and PI. So they said it's not anymore, but their actions suggest otherwise. Not a good organisation. Okay, so the role of audits works hand in glove with the conversion bans, because if you've got a gender identity that's so vague, and you need to protect yourself as an organisation because anyone could be had up, then you've got this audit that says you are compliant. And because this audit was created by ACON and it's hand in hand with the government, these two things are fitting hand in hand. So the Government sets up a committee that scares the heck out of everybody, and then the other arm, ACON, which makes a heck of a lot of money from this, sets up the rules that, and the certification and the standards that you must comply to embed gender identity ideology into culture and make a shitload of money for a lot of people. So it creates, the audits create a one-size-must-fit-all policy that embeds it as gender identity ideology as a norm into every Australian workplace, into federal, state and local governments. Sign up to this, into major organisations like Amazon, for example, into media outlets like ABC and SBS sign up to this, into schools and universities and corporate organisations. And it has those requirements that it allows. You can pause and read it, but I'm going to go through it now anyway. So, one, it creates a special class. So if you remember, one of the goals of Denton's is that you want to make the cost of transitioning a lot simpler. You want to reduce the cost. You want the government to pay for it. You want the people to pay for it, the taxpayer to pay for it. You want corporates to pay for it. So this audit actually has that in it, that you provide a special paid leave for employees and a whole bunch of other benefits to undergo sex reassignment or gender-affirming medical procedures and surgeries. So you don't get that with someone who's suffering cancer or endometriosis or might be going through menopause or other things, just for this special class. Okay. Then you've got compelled speech, and that's really particularly serious. Maybe you might want to stop saying speech, racist things or like that, but no one compels you to say things that are support of an ideology. But now, with this AWEI put in places like Victoria, you have actually got a state-sanctioned ideology. And so that's pronouns, whether you believe it or not that a person is a male or a female, because this man actually, this woman is actually a man. Pronouns you have to accept, and they sex-based language, like you remove you put in gender-neutral language, which basically means you remove words around womanhood. Not men, of course, but womanhood. So women become menstruators, women become cervix holders, vulva owners, bodies with vaginas, that sort of thing. And you audit free speech. In this University of Melbourne, you audit free speech. The people allowed to talk are the queer and the gender identity ideologists and the trans advocacy groups, but anyone else that says anything that that challenges the non-evidence base to this ideology, or the fact that it's an ideology, or the fact that you don't conform to it, that is sanctioned. That is non-approved. And by the way, AWEI members pay to be audited ranked by Pride and Diversity. So the program imposes both a positive and substantial compliance and financial burden on organisations who sign up to AWEI, and the money involved in this. Like for example, I looked at an invoice for Sports Australia just for something, it's 10 grand pop. There's no way small organisations can afford this. 95% of all our tax actually comes from small businesses, not from large business. It comes from small, by the way. Okay, no way they can afford all this. So there's a kind of anti-competitive element brought in by the state to all this that puts the big players and the big guys pushing down on the small guys who can't afford this kind of compliance. It puts them at risk if they don't have it. Not that we want it. So, propaganda is a big part of the AWEI. CEO, all divisions of an organisation, all the layers of organisation, human resources, and the top, and all the small organisations, they have to get diversity and inclusion training. They've got to be, they've got to celebrate the LGBTQIA days and months and weeks as part of the ACON calendar. They've got to help in executive sponsorship. They're not only proselyting and do pep talks and all the rest of it into the organisation, but they have to proselyte externally. So, for example, ABC and SBS have signed up to types of films and documentaries promoting gender identity ideology to us, the wider public, as part of the AWEI. So I'll put some links to that so you can have a look for yourself. you know, and then of course put your corporate branding on everything to show everybody that you're compliant. Okay, that's a snapshot page if you want to take a snapshot of that. Okay. So this is an excellent revenue stream, by the way. ACON makes money not just selling the AWEI and invoicing for training, etc., but also it's a marketing scheme for them to keep on selling their product. It's very rare that you have a client have to sell a product that they purchase, but this is the case with this audit. And one of the key things about it, of course, it removes safeguarding and safety for women, which is a goal, to remove the rights of women, because who is the biggest threat to gender identity ideology? It is women. What are the threats? What are the things they want to remove? They want to remove safeguarding around children. Who's the biggest threat? It's women. You know, parents, women, homosexual, particularly lesbians. So removal of single-sex spaces and shortlisting and removal of women to be in positions of leadership that are set up for them to lead. You have men instead will do that, will do the leading. Marketing. So, as I mentioned, there's a marketing aspect to ACON, that anyone who signs up have to be part of the marketing, and not just for internally, but externally. But the thing that really was curious about this is the third-party auditing to grow their member base. So, if I click on the next page, you can pause and read this if you want. But the one interesting part of looking at the AWEI and looking it up also what this University of Melbourne was doing is I found that you also, third-party vendors and suppliers to the organisation who signed up have to be compliant as well. Otherwise they can't do business with that organisation. So if you're Amazon or a major large corporation, if you want to do business with them, you have to sign up to it. Okay. Now, look, it doesn't technically say that, but being in that position of answering tenders, I know that if I come up to a requirement of blah, 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 I'm going to ask the client, okay, is there certification around this standard? What do you recognize as being compliant to this? And they'll tell you, oh, this, AWEI. And that is just a multi-level marketing strategy to spread gender identity ideology, not just the organization, but then to spread it to make it compulsory for people who supply to them. It's unbelievably shocking. There's got to be some kind of law against it, seriously. So here's a couple of things that were particularly concerning: displaying any speech that upsets the T. This was out of the University of Melbourne's GA draft. Now it's been a few months since then, so things may have got better. But you'll notice straight away that they were auditing free speech. You can read that in your own time, just as a proof of pudding. And also requests for pronouns and descriptions as affirmed by the TG person. Now, I heard, I've got to check if this actually happened, but I heard there was rumour that they weren't going to make it compulsory. But here's the thing: a lot of the universities are now basically corporate bodies. They put a lot of focus on research, and to get research done, they get money from large suppliers. And one thing I looked at when I looked at University of Melbourne, he was getting quite a large amount of money from LGBTQ foundations. Like in one case alone, there was $20 million. So when you've got a LGBTQ funding organisation, they're wanting you to be compliant in order to get their millions. So don't tell me that that's not going to influence how that policy is going to be enacted in that organisation. And a case in point happened in March this year. An associate professor set up a website called noconflicttheysaid.org to collect all the testimonies of people impacted by gender identity ideology. In the first 2 days there was 900 submissions, there was 19,000 hits, and as someone who was helping with the actual creation of the the technical side of the website, supporting her, I can attest that that was the case. And as a result of that website, there was organised a march against this professor. She was defamed. She had her office ransacked. She was bullied. People who went to support her, they were assaulted, physically assaulted. They had megaphones shoved in their ear and people speaking through megaphones into their ear. And this is all against the workplace safety and health, whatever it is, policy of the university. And I outlined it and I highlighted all the things that were done. And up to this day, not one action was taken against the queer union who did this, even though it's plain to see who was who and who did what. Not one. But lots of complaints were brought against the associate professor. Let me click. So that told me straight away, as is typical of the Thomson Reuters direction, is that one of the things you do is you silence dissenters. You know, you limit free speech, done. You silence the media. They couldn't in this case because we organised people to photograph and videotape everything that was going on, and we sent it to the media. Silence prominent dissenters, which is what they were doing with the associate professor, and threats of sanctions, which were a few. Ideological compliance, of course, is made through the conversion bans and through the committee. So criminal sanctions, assessments done through AWEI, audits done through AWEI, virtual signalling because you get rewards and you get ranked and you have these end of year medals and ceremonies showing off who are the good guys, and threats, defamation, and violence and mockery if you are anyone who's speaking up. Remember, one of the goals of the stakeholders is to grow the consumer base, to grow the transgenders, grow people who are on drugs, surgeries, buying social transitioning products, medical products and surgical products. And one of the goals that Denton's put in place is reduce the cost of transitioners. And so hence why they're a special class, and AWE makes it so that they get free paid leave for when they do surgery. Reduce the costs, put the costs onto the corporation, put the costs onto the organisation, put the costs onto the taxpayer. And remove, so that also removes negative consequences to taking time out to do that. And, you know, as usual in the organisations, when you talk to young people who are homosexual are targeted, particularly lesbians. It's only colloquial, but you hear it enough, that they're targeted. Why aren't you trans? Because, you know, you're in the wrong body. And of course, the reframing the worldview is about around language. Change the language. Change pronouns, gendered language to push this idea that the body is not connected to your gender, to your identity. Your real identity is kind of like a soul that is disassociated with your body, you know, and vision statements and marketing. Those are the things that you do to bring about cultural change. And that is how the conversion therapy ban and the audits work hand in hand. So, there you've got it. Cultural shift from evidence-based reality that we're coming from, to a feeling-based ideology, to a state-sanctioned ideology, to something that came in by stealth, that something came on by working with compliance with state and LGBTQIA. And the thing that has happened is, in the past video I talked about the change agents were originally that four core group of, you know, IlGA, the youth transactionists, IlGA, the trainers of change management and trainers of the youth activists, and Denton's that provided the laws, and Thomson Reuters that provided the marketing schemes. But now what you've done is you've made organisations as the change agents. They are doing all that because you've made it happen through your conversion ban, and you made it happen through the AWEI. You made it happen through the diversity and inclusion audits. And I would say, once you have every organisation working to be compliant to the audits in government, in schools, in universities, in major corporations, we'll have this as our culture, without debate, without discussion, without input from the majority of people who we damn well know is not for this, and bypassing democracy entirely for something that is autocratic, authoritarian, and extremely dangerous for women as an ontological class, and for the rights and safeguarding of women and children. So here ends my talk.